So good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Fish. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology here at the University of Chicago. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this installment of the Center for International Studies year-long speaker series on global inequalities, conditions and consequences of social and natural disparity. Through this series, CIS, together with the Program on the Global Environment, has endeavored to investigate the character and experience of inequality in today's global economy. This is a plug for coming events. The spring quarter talks will include the historian and subaltern studies scholar Gainendra Pandey on global racisms and anthropologist Kim Fortune on inequality in late industrialism. Quotes. CIS also invites you to all these future events. So today, with the generous help of the Center for East Asian Studies, we are thrilled to welcome Professor Anne Allison back to the University of Chicago to speak on Greeting the Dead, Managing Solitary Existence in Japan. And I say back, of course, because Professor Allison did her graduate studies at the University of Chicago, and she did her undergraduate studies also in Chicago, Illinois, but it was in Chicago Circle campus, so she just loves Chicago, apparently, loves the weather, and she couldn't get out. So today she has moved on to bigger and better things and to warmer climates, as she is the Robert O. Keohane Professor of Cultural Anthropology and the Professor of Women's Studies at Duke University. Of course, for a long time, starting from around the early 1980s, Japan was not a country that came to mind when people, including academics, spoke of inequality and economic deprivation. The image that was produced in much discourse from and about Japan was one of a so-called economic miracle in which the contradictions of modernity had been seemingly overcome to enable a fabulously productive machine of social cohesion, healthy middle-class values, and infinite economic return. But even before that image and the myth that it supported came apart, Professor Allison's first book, Night Work, Sexuality, Pleasure, and Corporate Masculinity in a Tokyo Hostess Club from the University of Chicago Press in 1994, provided a view of the tremendous price paid to sustain that image. An ethnography of female hostess clubs and their corollary male corporate practices, Nightwork offered an intimate and critical look at the gendered labor of performative intimacy and desire. Professor Allison's work has continued in this vein, grappling with questions, scenes, and contradictions of life's day-to-day gendered intimacies forged within but also under the constant overbearing pressure of Japan's massive cultural industry and political economic machine. In her book, Permitted and Prohibited, Desires, Mothers, Comics, and Censorship in Japan, published in 2000 by the University of California Press, she explores how the very desire informing capitalist production and consumption emerges in the linkage between discourses of motherhood, pornographic comics, and popular culture. And in her 2006 work, Millennial Monsters, Japanese Toys, and the Global Imagination, also from the University of California Press, Professor Allison offers us an ethnography of the entangled fantasies of capitalism and cultural politics driving production of consumption for youth in Japan and within a global marketplace. So there was perhaps no one better poised than Professor Allison to deal with the staggering sense of disillusionment and emotional fallout of Japan's 1990 economic crisis, as it morphed into a decade and then 2 decades of economic recession. And she does this in her most recent work, Precarious Japan, in which she explores the lived and particularly affective dimensions of what has become a highly precarious day-to-day reality in 21st century Japan. The image that emerges from this book is one of a country deeply entrenched in a sense of existential crisis, where the perpetual management of crisis amidst rapidly diminishing hope of its resolve has become the status quo. But her analysis is particularly powerful for the attention that it pays to the effective disconnections engendered by crisis among Japanese youth, who are made vulnerable by the structural inequalities produced through Japan's neoliberal embrace. I don't want to say, I'm sure she'll say more about these themes as we, in her talk, and I don't want to say more, too much more at this point because I've already taken up a lot of time, but I do want to point out that along with her many articles in prestigious journals, Professor Allison, together with Professor Charles Peyot, edited the journal Cultural Anthropology from 2011 to 2014, and thus helped shape the concerns that animate cultural anthropology in the United States and abroad. And finally, I want to add that perhaps more than any anthropologist of Japan, anthropologists looking at Japan, Professor Allison has worked to put Japan on the world map, and she has done so in ways that I think attend to its cultural specificity while making Japan relevant to anthropology in general. And in so doing, she's really sort of almost in some ways taken Japan out of a very sort of ethnographic ghetto of anthropology and brought it onto the world stage. And I think that's one of the reasons that makes her work so accessible. I remember when the first time I talked to a publisher, he said, well, can you write a book like Anne Allison? I think what he was meaning was that these were books that were about Japan, but they spoke to anthropology at large. And I think that that's something that anthropology has, particularly anthropology of Japan, has struggled to do, but Anne has done it very well. So just one final quick note about the event format. After the talk, there will be time for discussions, for questions from the audience. After the Q&A period, we invite you to a reception where wine and other sort of good refreshments, I saw the plates, they look good, await you outside. And the seminary co-op will be there to offer copies of Precarious Japan on sale, autographed or not autographed, I don't know. And so we encourage you to join us for this continuation of the event. So without further ado, let us all please welcome Professor Anne Allison.
Thank you, Michael, for that generous introduction. Thank you for the Center of International Studies and East Asian Studies for inviting me here. This is the first time I've been back to University of Chicago to talk, so it's a real honor, and it's a real honor that Marshall Solins is sitting right here. I'm a little nervous, and many friends in the room, so thank you very much. In the book that Michael told me about, wherever you are, I deal with precarity, a sense of unsettlement and insecurity that has conditioned the temperament and material lives of many, if not all, Japanese since the bursting of the bubble economy in 1991 and the onset of an enduring economic recession. I treat precarity as anchored in, but not limited to, the irregularity of job and income, an increasing reality for more and more Japanese, and consider how it spreads and insinuates itself in the corpuscles of everyday life, even, borrowing this from Bifo Barati, one's soul, as in how one lives within a temporality that can feel futureless and stuck, within a space of not fitting or getting recognized much of anywhere, and in a condition of inhabitation that is or feels homeless, what I kept hearing people express during field work with the phrase, ibasho ga nai, there's no place where I feel at home. In the book, I trace precarity more in terms of life, how people are trying to live, though sometimes having a hard time of it, in social, economic, existential conditions they find to be slippery and insecure. In the paper I delivered today, which is very preliminary, and which I'm actually just trying to consider whether it should develop into anything, so maybe you can help me think about that, I consider precarity more in the register of death. If precarity can be defined as insecurity in the conditions of existence, can this extend to the state of the dead? Those who find or contemplate the end of life all alone, without anyone to mourn them, lacking a grave to be their home post-death. The homeless dead? So I'm going to read this. The paper is called Greeting the Dead, Managing Solitary Existence in Japan. Even Tokyo slows down during Obon, the season of greeting and revisiting the dead. It is August 2013, and the day is still as my friend and I head to a cemetery at the edge of the city. She has asked me to accompany her because these spaces of death are unsettling, a sentiment she says is common these days in Japan. Once death and the dead were part of everyone's everyday, People died at home, were buried in or close to rice fields outside the house, and received offerings and visitations daily at household shrines. But now, and particularly in the cities, people rush about and concentrate their energies on other things. Less tethered to the land and to the ancestors buried there, Japanese have left death to the experts, funerary companies, and the Buddhist priests at the temples where family plots are maintained. When someone dies, a family contracts a funerary company to do the services and contacts the priest at the Buddhist temple or their parishioners to handle the memorial and burial. The expense has become exorbitant, and for its handling of the dead, the only time or service for which many turn to religion at all during their lives, Buddhism becomes known as the religion of death, an unseemly association, tinged by the money that temples and priests earn in the process. On this day, the temple is quiet. We are the only visitors to the cemetery, and Maya finds the grave she is seeking with ease. The plot is unkempt, the telltale sign of neglect by those family members who should be tending it, a wife and son in this case. Just as I suspected, she says, as she greets the friend who is buried there, a former colleague with whom she ran a business for years. Clapping her hands and bowing her head, she quickly sets to straightening things up. She pulls weeds and pours water over the stones in front of the graveside. Speaking softly, she tells her friend about the business and how she's been doing herself. The flowers she has brought are put in stone vases on the grave, and the incense and candles lit in the box altar underneath. Finally, looking purposeful, Maya claps her hands, bows her head, and claps once again. I follow her lead, and then we walk off. The visit has been good, and Maya tells me she's happy she's come. But it's not exactly her place to be tending to the grave, as the priest keeps telling her. Yet his wife and son don't do their duty. And Maya bears her own guilt in not being more attentive to her friend when, after the Lehman shock of 2008 almost wiped out their business, he fell into a deep depression. When he committed suicide, he was all alone, and Maya was the one who discovered his body 3 days later. The rate of suicide went up in 1998 during the lost decade of economic decline, and despite a slight dip in recent years, it has stayed high ever since, between 32 and 33,000 deaths a year. Men are twice as likely as women to commit suicide, often driven by problems related to money or job. Despite its prevalence, though, suicide is not something people easily talk about, and Maya is no exception concerning her friend. Yet suicide is not the only form of death that is socially troubling these days. Another is the phenomenon much in the news lately of what is called lonely or solitary death. Persons who die alone and whose bodies are discovered days or weeks after the fact. As reported by NHK in its television special on Japan's relationless society, Muen Shikai, there were 33,000 such deaths in 2009, a number eerily consistent with that of suicide. When such bodies go unclaimed by their families and increasingly common circumstances, the remains get sent to Buddhist temples, where they're placed in communal plots for the socially disconnected, Muen Butoke, a sign of social abandonment and eternal solitude. This is an unenviable state, becoming literally a relationless Buddha. As we leave the cemetery, we see the plot assigned these displaced dead. A corner of the graveyard labeled Muembo. The grass is overgrown and there are no flowers, offerings, or containers for them of any kind. Of course, Maya says, for these are the deceased who lack, mu, connection, en, having no one to tend to one's grave. But despite her own efforts to care for her friend's soul and tidy his grave, this is likely to become his fate as well. For, as the priest tells her, it's up to the man's son to do the memorial rites, kuyo, and pay the annual maintenance fees at the temple. Because the son fails to do so, the father will soon become an abandoned soul, which means his remains will eventually be moved from the family grave where he is marked by name and Buddhist name on a mortuary tablet of his own, to the grave for the disconnected, where his ashes will mingle with others and his identity become both collective and unknown. Just as she couldn't save him in life, Maya can't save her friend in death. But why is this so? And what does this say about the logic and practices of death at a moment when Japanese are increasingly living and dying alone and progressively dislodged from those ties of family work locale once expected to perform caregiving to both the living and the dead? 1/3 of all Japanese live alone today. 1/4 of those of marriageable age aren't married. 1/4 of the population is age 65 or older, and the rise in social or intimate isolation is correlated with the precarity of income and job. Men with regular jobs are twice as likely to marry as those irregularly employed, for example. Singleification, shinguraka, as the sociologist Yamada Masahiro calls it, is the new social fact of living and dying in 21st century Japan. And not only are the rates of marriage and childbirth down, and these are linked, only 2% of births occur outside of wedlock, so is the desire to couple altogether. In Yamada's view, the trend towards singleification indexes a rise in the socially stranded and existentially bereft, what he calls refugees. For what religion and community once provided, then family and work, a social place and network for support, has now been tasked to the self-responsibility of the individual, which, according to Yamada, makes the reality of life and death risky. But not everyone finds such terms of existence, of dying without family, living all alone, to mean the end of relationality or refugeization of humanity. And as new forms of being in the world with and without others are starting to emerge, so are new practices for treating the dead. This is the issue I take up here. That is, at a moment when the ecology of attachment to others is rapidly changing in Japan, what is happening to the sociality of the dead? Both to the place given death and dead in the landscape of the still living, but also to those assigned the place of remembering the dead and of keeping the living from dying through companionship and care. Until recently, the family. What does increased solitarization actually mean for those living through it and dying without others to grieve them? Under what conditions and for whom is this a state of precarious living and not being courted, in Judith Butler's terms, a grievable death? And how is the trend towards singleification changing the grammar of existence and the calculus given the dead? The next section is called One's Place in Death. On a hot evening, August 2013, I meet two friends at a bar. We're in the high-rise district of Shinjuku, and one of the women has just come from visiting the graves of an aunt and uncle buried nearby. Neither is buried in a traditional family plot, she tells me, rather because both were single and had no children to perform the memorial rites, kuyo. First one, then the other chose to be buried in a new system of eternal memorialization, eitai kuyo, where ashes are interred in a collective room and temple officiants rather than family perform kuyo, memorial. Starting in the late 1980s, the system has become increasingly popular. When I visit Tojoji myself in summer 2014, I am told that there are two kinds of relationship one can have with the temple. One is the standard, to be a longtime parishioner, a family tie sustained over generations, and with considerable financial commitment, and to be buried when the time comes in the family plot. The other, which doesn't require joining the temple or even being Buddhist, is to become a member of the Relationship Association, Enokai, by paying a one-time membership fee of 800,000 yen, about $8,000, 1/5 the cost of a regular grave. A relationship that is more of a service. Here one joins the association to be given a place at death and memorial rites as if, but not exactly, by one's family. Concretely, what membership comes down to is receiving an interment ceremony, yearly memorial rites, a Buddhist name, kaimyo, given them by a priest and engraved on a memorial plaque, and burial of one's ashes in an individual urn in a collective room for 32 years, after which time they get mixed together and deposited in a communal ossuary. The brochure for Tojoji Temple lays out the logic of eternal memorial in post-familial terms. Within Nokai, one has the opportunity to choose a new style of burial made so that all pray according to relations transcending those of blood. Being disconnected, muen, from family doesn't signal the absence of relationality altogether, but rather the possibility of being open to new kinds of connectedness. The day I visit Tojoji, it is pouring down rain. Set back from the street, it consumes an entire city block. Designed in a mixture of traditional and modern, the temple evokes simplicity and charm, elegance and efficiency. The only one to have signed up for that day's information session, I'm given a cup of tea and instructed in the basics of the temple, following the bullet points laid out in his Tony brochure. We then go on a tour of the premises. A 400-year-old Soto Zen Buddhist temple, Tojoji has been renovated multiple times, and most recently in 1996, when the former head priest, Takezawa Kazuo, started the system of Eitai Kuyo as a strategy to keep the temple solvent in struggling times. Buddhist temples are closing and downsizing all over Japan, as religion retreats ever further in the lives of a population that highly self-reports as unreligious and are less willing or able to pay large donations to temples for burials. But rather than sell or lease some of its land, a tactic taken by other urban temples, Takezawa decided to tweak the principles of temple membership and its strategies for servicing death, adopting eternal memorial and hiring a management firm to help run the Relationship Association. Tojoji gained 8,000 new members by 2004 and had sold all its 10,000 spots for eternal burial by 2008. By all appearances, the temple is now thriving, having been given new life as a result of its new management of the dead. But it's not economics that my guide stresses as she takes me on the tour. Rather, after pointing out the area for family graves, where, as Ms. Yamada puts it, it is necessary to have descendants for burial, she moves to those areas in the temple that are less exclusive, open to anyone under a logic of belonging she calls both egalitarian and free. Whereas once it was extended family, then nuclear family that buried the deceased, now it is the individual, which Mrs. Yamada says is a good thing. For with Eitai Kuyo, one acquires freedom in connecting with another in different ways. Here, mourning is not restricted to family and can be done by even friends. But in her sociology lesson of the dead, Ms. Yamada leaves unstated one thing. It is the prospect of being unmourned by anyone that draws many people to eternal memorial. The fate of becoming a muen batoke, relationless soul, what the poor have little recourse over, and what those with the means, like a friend who is considering it because the thought of no one tending her grave is too sad, can choose to avoid. Continuing with our tour, we have now reached the Hall of 1,000 Hands, a small but comforting room that holds the black lacquered memorial tablets of all association members, inscribed with the Buddhist names they receive here before death, an unusual practice offered by Tojoji. This is the area for the family graves. We then go to the idyllic water garden located outside, a tranquil pool of water embedded with 41 stone islands, each holding 81 markers of the living names of the deceased. With trendy artwork on the side and a prayer hall with sliding walls at one end, this is where the monthly memorial of 1,000 Lights is held, when visitors light votive candles at dusk to pay their respects to the deceased, theirs and everyone else's. As for the actual ashes of the dead, they are buried 2 floors underneath the temple, where access seems more restricted. But the principle of eternal memorial, as is stressed over and over in the tour, is what Mark Rowe has called limitless connection, connecting anonymously, collectively, to others who share the fact of being here, otherwise all alone. As I learned from the conversation I have summer 2014 with a number of middle-aged Japanese, where to place the dead, and the place death itself assumes in the currency and temporality of connectedness is a complex, troubling issue, and not easy to sort out, given shifting familial and economic dynamics these days. Many people are single and don't fit the family grave, even if there is one. But for another woman, it is because she is married and had to change her maiden name, required by law, that prevents her from entering her father's family plot, where she would choose to go because her husband's family has no plot. Childless, she is also worried about who will perform memorials, which, by custom, should be performed twice a year and on regular anniversaries of death for a period up to 33 years. But she is worried not just about her own soul and that of her husband's, but also those of her mother and father. Her mother lives far away and is aging now. But if she brings her mother into her home to caregive her in life, who will tend to the grave of the dead father left behind? All of this has become so troubling to this woman, a political radical who claims no religious tendencies at all, that she is having difficulty sleeping at night. When we visit a temple that practices eternal memorial close to where she lives in Niigata Prefecture, the Nichiren Temple, Kakuda Myokoji, the priest tells her that this is nothing to worry about, that flexible arrangements of connection, memorial, can be made here. He should know. With only daughters and no grandsons, he faces the same problem of no place to go upon death and no one to take over the temple. It was anticipating this situation that inspired Ogawa Eiji, the head priest of Myokoji Temple, to start the first system of eternal memorial in the country. This was 1989. The same year he wrote what was a controversial article, noting how the burial system had long been tied to the family and family graves at Buddhist temples. He advocated making it acceptable to be buried outside family attachments, as an individual or communally. While initially this generated much criticism, now it is the opposite, Ogawa tells us. People are constantly coming to Myokoji for seminars and to seek out advice. Individuals struggling with the issue of where to go when I die, and Buddhist practitioners keen for the know-how on how to diversify their religious practice. And in both cases, if inversely, there's also the issue of money, of individuals wanting to save on mortuary costs, and of Buddhist practitioners wanting to build business. As Ogawa concludes at the end of our conversation, I see the breakdown of the family system in Japan today as giving religion a new chance. But according to Inoue Haruo, a feminist who started collaborating with Ogawa and became involved with new end-of-life practices after reading his article in 1989, the relationship goes the other way. It is the family and the place women assume in it that is being given a new chance by eternal memorial. As she estimates from her own practice, 10% of women seeking eitaikuyo today are seeking so to break free after death from the bonds of a domineering marriage, husband, or mother-in-law. Typically saving up their own money to make this an autonomous decision, these women relish the idea of being buried as an individual rather than as the married-in member of their husband's family. Inoue calls this post-death divorce. The next section, one's place in life. The feminist Ueno Chizuko has written many books on being alone. 2 have been bestsellers, Ohistori-sama no Dogo, Aging Alone, and Otoko Ohistori-sama Do, The Path of a Gentleman Alone, that are guidebooks on how to manage living alone as one grows old. Motivated to write these books to counter the discriminatory image she's faced as a single woman, Ueno is committed to making the single-fied lifestyle more acceptable and robust. Developing resources and networks outside the family is key here, for as she quips, a good stable of friends is far better than a bad marriage. A highly respected scholar who was professor of anthropology at Tokyo University and remains a prolific author, she's now retired and has started an MPO for women. Living and dying alone can certainly bring misery, Ueno acknowledges. But in all the recent media attention to such phenomena as lonely or solitary death, there's an attitude of, where's the family here, that she contests. Quote, at the same time it is a resource, today is an age when the family is also a risk. Being alone, one merely dies alone. But speaking in the extreme, being with family could mean that one is killed by them. End of quote. As Ueno elaborates, the post-industrial Japanese family is pressured and constrained in various ways. And the kinds of attachment it is expected to foster, men bringing home the paycheck, women managing the home, children being brought up to perform competitively on exams and in the workplace, are not conducive to cultivating good communication skills. And for women, family can be particularly limiting, especially when husbands speak only 3 words to their wives: food, bath, sleep. Given a co-residential pattern like this, what's so bad about being alone? Ueno queries. In her work and life, Ueno Chizuko has consistently questioned the sociological dreariness assumed for the single and childless. But if lacking family doesn't necessarily consign one to existential vulnerability, the fact of having family doesn't inevitably protect one from solitude, as the labor historian Genda Yuji points out. For him, the issue relates more to employment, particularly for men. As he argues in his recent book, while the phenomenon of hikikimori, young people who withdraw into single room, usually in their parents' home where they live isolated for up to years, even decades. That's an old woman, that's not a hikikimori. A couple pictures of hikikimori. Is often used as an index for Japan's relationless society. Another solitary behavior is rising more quickly these days. This is solitary, non-employed persons, SNEP, Koritsu Mushoku, which is defined as unmarried, unemployed persons not connected to people outside family. According to government statistics, the number of unmarried, unemployed persons under 60 was 2.5 million in 2011. 63% of whom it identified as solitary. Those who answered they had not done anything such as have a conversation with a person outside the family in the past 2 days. Another study found that 1/3 hadn't engaged in an activity like take a trip or play sports with anyone else in the past year. The number of hikikimori has been reported to be around 1 million. Average age is now 32, 80% male, with onset usually at time of entrance exams to high school or entering the job market. But that of SNEP, according to Genda, is higher at about 1.5 million. The latter has risen alongside the downturn in the economy and labor market starting in the early 1990s. Between 1996 and 2011, the number of solitary non-employed persons doubled, a symptom of what Genda considers to be the insecuritization of labor and life in Japan today, particularly for middle-aged men. As shown in his earlier work on NEET, not in education, employment, or training, young people were hit hard by the collapse of the bubble economy in 1999, when a lost generation of youth couldn't find permanent jobs. But the category of NEET, officially defined as age 18 to 34, has now spread, according to Genda, who says there's been a NEETification of older workers as construction companies closed down, manufacturing grew strong overseas, and the yen inflated in the late 1990s. Many middle-aged and older workers lost their jobs and couldn't find or didn't look for other employment. According to Genda, this is the demographic increasingly at risk for and prone to solitarization. And while more have family than not, 80% live with family, this does not necessarily shield them from isolation, as shown by the fact that 2/3 still report as solitary. SNEP are vulnerable to depression, suicide, lonely death. They are also no longer exceptional. Today, anyone could become a SNP. They've become the new ordinary. From the way that he writes about it, it is obvious that Genda considers social isolation to be deadly, not only hard to survive, but also a factor in death itself. And Ueno, while not privileging marriage or family, recognizes the necessity of having other people in facing every day and end of life. And what both point to is the shifting terrain of the social, where the old grammar of belonging is unraveling without something else necessarily taking its place. While the individual is increasingly tasked with the responsibility of sustaining oneself in the free market environment of neoliberal Japan, how precisely to do this, when having a network of others has always been tied to one's place in society? a place that, for many, is becoming out of place or no place at all. In a recent article on depression, the psychiatrist Saito Tamaki points out how important recognition remains to Japanese at a time when it's also becoming increasingly hard to sustain. As he's noticed from his own practice, a new form of depression, shinkeutsu, has emerged over the past 10 years. While difficult to figure out, it seems that those who are prone to it are on the way to becoming or have already become social adults, marked by permanent jobs, marriage, or both. Men in their 30s are particularly likely candidates who fall depressed, leading sometimes to suicide after they've lost their job or are simply struggling to remain competitive at the age. I'm trying to stay competitive at the stage before they're due in their 40s to advance to divisional or sectional head in the company. For those trying to enter or already inside Japan's corporate culture, the pressure to perform is intense, and this collides with the fact that the level of satisfaction with work and the degree to which workers like their companies is the lowest in Japan of all industrial countries. So even those who have the jobs that SNEPs so sorely lack are at risk of depression, rates of which are rising amongst company workers as they are in the population in general. And while Japan's high rate of suicide started to fall in 2012, the one contingency for whom this is not true and for whom suicide is continuing to rise are men in their 30s. Losing a job, even when this comes from quitting it oneself, is often what precipitates suicide, but so is never getting one in the first place for those a generation younger entering the job market in May. Suicides spike in the months of May and now June, and disease of the heart, kokoro no byo, as depression is euphemistically called in Japan, has taken hold around the long-term company job, both for those excluded from it and for those stressed within just such a job. In the attention he pays to the relationship between depression and Japan's corporate culture, Saito puts his finger on something else, a dark hole in the very idea of place itself, as what confers identity and builds the ties of belonging to others. It's not only that people are nervous about not getting regular jobs or not getting married and having children. These very pathways to adulthood are themselves contested or found to be precarious in their own right these days. As Saito calls the latest disease of the heart amongst Japanese, this is a strange new form of depression. And at risk is anyone with or without job, living with family, or all alone. This would seem consistent with a kind of existential anxiety about one's very existence, that Usui Mafumi, a social psychologist at Niigata Seiryo University, reports hearing from the high school students with whom he also works as school counselor. In asking the students what they worry about, Fuan, the three most common answers are 1, their abilities, 2, their future, 3, their existence. The latter is the one that troubles him the most. Japanese teenagers asking themselves, why am I alive? Why do I exist? Why was I born? Unsure of who they are and where or whether they can ever fit in, life makes little sense. When I talk with Usui in summer 2014, he tells me about the online information site on suicide he started in 1997 and how the high school kids he sees today struggle even more with self-confidence. This leads them to withdraw from others and avoid human-to-human contact. Today, Japanese youth are speechless, he says, using the word mugon, mu for lacking, gon for speech. While everyone has a cell phone and is constantly twittering or otherwise plugged into social media, youth don't really talk and not in a form of face-to-face communication. The border between self and other is fragile, with which Usui illustrates by a recent trend he's observed amongst high school students of what is called fake or fashion masks, deta mask. Typically, surgical masks are worn in Japan when one has a cough or cold to prevent the spread of germs. But worn when healthy, the germs become people themselves. And by donning a mask, the wearer is ensconced in a cordon solitaire. These kids are not misanthropic usuists, and they would like relations with and recognition from their peers very much. But afraid of getting hurt, they wear masks in order to feel better, to be able to venture amongst people at all, which is not the case with hikikomori, who stay shut up behind four walls of a room they never leave. So solitarization here is a fashion style in times when human contact demands self-protection. The next section is called Practice of Life to Ward Off Self-Death. As a young man, Nemoto Itetsu was unruly and wild. He stayed out late listening to music, routinely got into fights, studied philosophy at university, but never graduated. Along the way, he worked at various jobs, but took nothing too seriously. One day, and more as a joke, his mother showed him a recruitment ad for Buddhist priests, and the son was intrigued. Applying for and getting the job, he started working as an entry-level monk doing routine tasks like pet funerals. Though it wasn't required, Nemoto sought to learn more and entered a Rinzai Zen monastery, where the training is so grueling that most initiates don't make it through. Given that a well-trained monk, it is said, lives as though he were already dead, few remain in Japan today. Nemoto's monastery only has 7. The focus of the Rinzai Zen sect is individual enlightenment, what Nemoto practiced for 4 years in the isolation of the monastery. He then decided to leave, to reacquaint himself with life outside. Taking a job at a fast food restaurant in Tokyo, he enjoyed the lightness of the work and the banter with customers and staff. Things were good. But his training hadn't been for this, he was told by his sect, who needed trained monks to become abbots of temples that were closing across the country. A small Rinzai Zen temple in the rice fields of Seki City in Gifu Prefecture, Daizenji, had lost its abbot and was on the verge of collapse when Nemoto agreed to step in. Built during the Heian period over 1,000 years ago, Daizenji required major renovations to keep it alive. This was Nemoto's first order of business, going door to door and phone call to raise the funds needed for the physical repairs. Once this was managed, reconstruction began. As a result, the temple is beautiful today. The day I visit, in June 2014, Nemoto points out the pieces of roof sitting on the ground from the reconstruction the previous year. They're 300 years old, he says with a smile. In front of the main gate sits rice fields, owned by the temple, where the rice has come for the lunch served by his wife. And in the back, the land stretches into overgrown fields and relaxed groves of trees. As head priest of Daizenji, Nemoto has 88 parishioners whom he tends to in all the usual ways, presiding over funerals, memorial services, the everyday running of the temple. But Nemoto also engages in something else that extends by tweaking the Buddhist work of managing the dead. This is tending to the still living who are contemplating self-death. Jishi, the word he prefers to suicide, jisatsu. Exposed at an early age, when an uncle then 2 high school friends committed suicide, Nemoto had long been intrigued by the suffering that puts humans in the vise between life and death. Having found that people open up to him with their life stories and pain when working at the fast food job, he started holding workshops on death and for hikikomori at Daizenji. He started a suicide website as well. Responding to everyone, Nemoto was endlessly engaged 24/7. He also became exhausted, trying to keep people alive who often couldn't articulate or stop talking about what was killing them. Eventually, Nemoto got sick himself and told he could die from the blocked arteries they discovered. He underwent 4 angioplasties over a 2-year period of time. In the New Yorker article about him, where I first learned about Nemoto and became interested in his work on suicide, this is where the story is pitched. At the point when too sick to keep responding to his emails and wanting to tell people why, he posted about his illness. The reactions were cold. They didn't care he was sick. They were sick too, they said. They were in pain, and he had to take care of them. After crying for a week and rethinking his work, Nemoto decided it was his karma to counsel the near dead. So he decided to continue, but by making some changes. One was demanding that in order to communicate with him, everyone first meet him in the flesh. This is why, in my case too, I go to Daizenji. But the story he tells me once there is somewhat different from that in the New Yorker. Not so much in the facts themselves, though there's no mention at all of the dramatic realization that those in pain are not necessarily sympathetic to that in others, as in the de-emphasis of facticity or linearity altogether. He lingers over my questions, and answers are anything but quick and direct. When I ask what he thinks accounts for the high rate of suicide, for example, he says, well, there's a long history of this in Japan, and today solitude is widespread. Many can't connect or communicate with others or find a reason for living. But in answer to whether certain contingencies are more at risk, such as the underemployed, Nemoto won't pin this down. Yes, many young people who are irregularly employed are struggling, and because Japanese men tend to turn inward rather than express or seek help for their problems, this leads to stress and isolation. His emphasis, though, is on the fact that anyone can become lonely and depressed, even those with a family and job. This is why Buddha, after all, left home, went into the world. Suffering is a fact of life, our existential condition rather than a problem that is easily fixed. But without realignment, the pain of living can fester out of control. Helping sufferers figure this out would seem to be Nemoto's mission. Nemoto often speaks through example of cases he's dealt with, like the woman in her 30s who had been suffering for years from an emotional disorder for which she'd been taking regimen upon regimen of medication. Obsessed with her condition, she had read everything on the subject and accumulated a library of information. Have you ever tried just letting it go? Nemoto asked her when she attended one of his workshops. After learning basic zazen, where one meditates by entering a space of nothingness, mu, the woman tried it and found that something immediately shifted. Starting to get relief, she has continued the practice and now given up medication altogether. Practice is important to Nemoto. Practicing ways of being in the world that can keep us from self-death. Constantly experimenting with different methods and strategies for such a life practice, Nemoto tells me about one of his newest, a workshop called Playback Theater. The third such one at Daizenji was held just the weekend before my visit. 30 people, ages 18 to 48, who signed up through a posting on social media. Over 2 days spent in a range of activities, including going to nearby hot springs and playing music, special attention was paid to expression. This meant not just communicating through talk, which everyone did by sharing stories of sadness and struggle, but also playing back different ways of being in and around body and space, theirs and everyone else's. One is an exercise where one person starts with a movement, such as a cartwheel, then touches the next person who does their own thing, like a headstand, who then touches the next person, triggering a round robin of touching, moving, morphing that spreads around the circle. Being here in the midst of others and as a part of an event feels good, Nemoto says. But once everyone leaves, it's easy to slip back into loneliness and depression. Then staying in touch or meeting up with connections made during the workshop is important, as is maintaining something of the practice of life learned during the theater to prevent death, held by the Buddhist priest at his Rinzai Zen temple amongst rice fields in Japan. Conclusion. In what I have read and encountered in the field on the subjects I take up here, the rise of singular living, the shift away from a sociality based on long-term bonds, solitary death, and eternal memorialization, there is a tendency to mark, at some point at least, this behavior through the character mu, absence, missing, lack. There are the relationless souls, muembotoke, graves for the disconnected, muembo, Japan's de-relational society, muenshakai, and the speechless youth, mugon, sheltered behind their masks. And in the face of this voiding of relationality, now much talked about in Japan, there are models posed for countering the risks of solitarization, many of which involve forging new connections. Volunteering or getting a less pressured job, as Genda suggests for SNEP, and Saito for the corporately depressed, and joining a temple with eternal memorial rather than get abandoned as a relationless soul. Place is critical in this flux around connectivity, as I've tried to show in this talk. And where one fits or not, and what or who determines the fitting or no longer does so, affects the dead as well as the living. And in both cases, there is a lot of stress and struggle around where one is to go and how to exist or die once there. But what I see as potentially the most radical thread coming out of the tumultuous shifts and strains around what I've called the social grammar of existence these days in Japan is the black hole in the concept of place that Saito Tamaki alluded to in his article on depression in corporate culture. Not only are Japanese having a hard time finding or keeping their place as social adults, as a full-time employed or married with children, but they're losing their conviction that there is such a place of stability, certainty for anyone. This provokes much existential anxiety. But losing one's attachment to attachment, particularly to such normative attachments, can also be liberating, as from the cruel optimism of expecting too much from our relationships, as noted by Lauren Berlant. And rather than rushing too quickly to replace one set of connections with another, might there not be something to lingering over the placelessness of existence today and learning how to better inhabit it? This is what I see in some of the most innovative work being done today in Japan around suicide, that of Nemoto Itetsu, for example. For him, Mu is at the heart of his practice, embracing the emptiness of existence in Zazen meditation and in providing those in pain a space to voice and share this with others. This is not really about belonging, about becoming a member of a group with the order, continuity, and exclusivity of membership, which is true of eternal memorial, that replacing the membership of family with the membership of a relationship association consigns those who have neither to the ranks of abandoned souls at death. More than belonging, Nemoto encourages a different way of being in life with others but also oneself that is cultivated through practice, such as practicing Zazen, where accepting the emptiness of Mu takes on a different meaning from the Mu-en of the relationless dead, relationless society, relationless souls. Rather than a sign of social death here, Mu becomes a practice for life, of living despite and in the midst of suffering, and by doing so becoming something different. As the autonomous Marxist Bifo Barati has said about the radical possibilities for sociality and suffering, by surviving and sharing the pain of precarity, or refusing and withdrawing from the conditions of living that are destructive to oneself and others, suffering can transform into subjectivity, consciousness, solidarity. Something of this logic can also be seen in the most radical proposals around new practices of and for the dead, such as those by Shimada Hiromi, a professor of religion and head of the Society to Make Funerals Free, who, as in his recent book, Zero Funeral, advocates stripping funerals and burials down to the bare bones and refusing to treat the dead through the crucible of money. Disgusted at the high mortuary costs these days, even for eternal memorial, and what he sees as social rituals whose symbolics, as well as the relationships embedding them, have been emptied over time, he suggests a more extreme alternative to the family grave, rather than the post-familial, individually communal, eternal memorial system. Instead, he says, let's get rid of placing the dead altogether. Zazen in the grave. Thanks. If I've left any time for questions, I'm happy to take some. Yes. Yes.
Well, in terms of objective precarity, women are much more handicapped socially in Japan. For example, the average income of a single household and one-parent family household is much lower for women than men. Of course, the proportion of regularly employed is much higher for women than men. So objective precarity is much higher for women than men. But nonetheless, as you mentioned that suicide rate is much higher for men than women.
But apparently the depression rate is much higher for women than for men.
And so, and other things, of course, is that also human rate is much higher for men and women. So exclusion from the sort of traditional commitment to the employer and so forth had a much bigger impact on men than women. As you mentioned, in the case of the sort of post-death divorce, there's a stronger orientation toward the individualization and also out of the social network across sort of traditional sort of relations is much more abundant for women than men. And that's gender makes much more difference actually in coping precariness apparently. Any further gender issues?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot of different issues that play into precarity, and yeah, thank you for that comment. Certainly gender. Yeah, gender is a big difference. I mean, I hear that single elderly women have a very hard time and are quite precarious. But also, as you say, for men who either are or think they ought to have that solid, regular job at a company that lasts for decades, if not a lifetime, if they don't get that, they're particularly precarious. Even if they have that and lose that, they become precarious. And so, yeah, I mean, gender affects them differently. I mean, maybe you could say that women and men are precarious in different ways. I mean, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, especially in Japan, it seems to be like this right now.
Thank you. Yeah, Michael.
Yeah, I'm wondering how, well, I have a couple of questions, which I'm going to talk first of all, instead of connected, disconnected, with degrees of connectivity, and what kind of registers of connection. You do speak in terms of the affective connection and all of that. But it seems in some sense that even Komori, they're disconnected, but they're highly connected to this other world. And they're never Komori alone because they have to have the support of the infrastructure.
That's right.
So they are connected with the degrees of connectivity, sort of the connection without something else. So it seems in many ways that Japan is always being argued as once it was argued as over-connected as Buddhism, and now we're arguing underconnected as more in Shakai and whatnot. So it seems in terms of sort of a discourse on the degrees of connectivity, stepping back in a sense and to look at this at a discursive level of the sort of persistent anxiety around the crisis of connectivity.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I gave a, sorry. Yeah, thank you. Okay, sorry. I gave a version of this talk someplace else, and we kind of talked about that too, the nature, degree, definition of connectivity, and the nature and degree of, how do we define the social as well. And you're right that it's a danger to lump all the kinds and possibilities of connection together. And hikikomori, who are isolated into their rooms or their own apartment, they rely, for one thing, they rely on the food or the financial support of parents. I mean, those people who don't have that probably couldn't become hikikomori; they become homeless. And some of them, and some of them are connected online. Are they doing video games? Are they doing chat rooms? I mean, that's, my sense is that they're not all doing the same kind of thing. But you're right to raise the question of what is connection, what is communication, so if they have a relationship with, people who they never see face to face, does that mean it's not a relationship? And what kind of connection is that? No, it's a really good, it's a really good point. And I think it's really complicated. I just discovered just recently a statistic that surprised me, that the rate of the elderly suicide is actually higher in the countryside than it is in the city. And that kind of goes to your point that you might imagine, in the countryside, they're probably more likely to be in extended families. Yeah, this whole kind of romantic notion of the family, right? And in the cities, alienation. And apparently that's not true. That, and that too is, just to your point, that connectedness is, it's complicated, and it could be shifting, and absolutely, but the suicide rate is still pretty high, so that's, well, this gentleman has a question. Should we let him go first and then come back to?
Yes. What about secular death in Japan?
What about?
Secular death in Japan. Possibility of secular death, not?
Oh, secular death.
Yes.
Well, that's a great question, because, most Japanese report is not religious. But, and again, as I had said, I'm just kind of starting this project and trying to understand the relationship between death and Buddhism. But at some point, and whether that was at the end of the Meiji period or the beginning of, the 20th century, that death became, the literally putting the ashes and doing the memorial became relegated to Buddhism, whether you're Buddhist or not. So families are expected to have a relationship with their local, Buddhist temple or some local Buddhist temple. And then you have a plot and then you keep money and that's then where you all get buried. And so that relationship between the family and Buddhism is beginning to fall apart and on all these different fronts.
But if you belong to another religion by chance,
well, you see, yes, and again, there may be another person in the room who knows this better than I do. My best friend is Christian. She's not Buddhist. And yet, so I think some of this is cultural, under the guise of religious. And she has all the same anxieties and all the same worries, and she wants someone to be able to perform memorial, but she's Christian. She's not, So I think it kind of is cultural. And then I think there's also kind of a status thing here, too, because if you do Eitai Kuyo, Eternal Memorial, you get this Buddhist name, Akaimyo, but apparently a lot of them are kind of low grade. And there's an incredible market. I mean, the value of a high-priced Buddhist name, apparently you can pay tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars for a Buddhist name. And then there's this status thing too. And then if you're at all in the know, oh, that's like a low level. So someone was telling me about Eitai Kuyo. She said, well, I like the idea that someone would memorialize me because I don't have any kids, but I think I'd get a low-grade Buddhist name, and I'm not attracted to that part of it at all. So that's not religious, right? So that's more cultural and capitalist and yeah. So it's a great question. Michael, maybe we have, Andy.
Yes, so I was really taken by a formulation that you offered near the end of the paper, that of losing one's attachment to attachment. And as I
am very informed and influenced by Lauren here. Yeah.
Noted. But as I heard it in terms of the paper you presented, it speaks of moving beyond, or perhaps the obsolescence of certain categories and institutions that mediated attachment,
right.
Specifically the family, as well as with the workplace. Those seem to be the two primary ones, and I'm thinking of precarious Japan as well. But I was curious what new types of institutions or concepts might be mediating these post-attachment attachments. Obviously, you speak of some, but I was wondering if you could elaborate further.
Yeah, well, that kind of sounds a little bit, articulated in slightly different terms, the same question that Michael is asking me about connection. Great. Great question. In the book, if you've read it, you know that I do have a chapter where I kind of ask that question about what else is emerging when people don't have the same kinds of connections, or those connections, those institutions, as you call it, for providing those connections are drying up. And there are things that are emerging. There are these kind of drop-in, tea rooms or living rooms where there's no sense of belonging. You can go there just for a day or just for 4 hours, and they're kind of rigid anti-rules. They're kind of they're not rule. You're not allowed to poke into anyone else's business there, and everyone's supposed to pitch in, and it's supposed to be much more fluid than what would be the tendency towards hierarchical distinctions in most social institutions. And there's a lot of volunteer work. I did my final chapter in the book is about post 3/11. Where there was an incredible amount of volunteerism, and particularly right at first, there was a lot of DIY, do it yourself. A lot of stuff. I knew people who just got in their car. They had a friend. They went with 2 people, or they went with 3 people, right? There's just a lot of this stuff happening and people who would say not only did they feel that they were helping Japan and helping the people of Tohoku, that they were kind of helping restitch a sense of community and connectedness on different grounds. And so my sense is that one of the reasons why this kind of precarity around the social, which I've laid out quite a bit in the book and trying to work here in the Register of Death, is such an issue, is that I think maybe in the 70s and 80s and 90s, there just weren't a lot of those other institutions. Things got kind of rigidified. And in part, that was helped by the fact that the economy was doing well. I mean, there was plenty of precarity during that period too, and plenty of women. I mean, women have always been pretty precarious compared to men. I mean, that was certainly true at the height of the bubble economy, for goodness sakes. That was certainly true. But my sense is that what had been a whole host of other kinds of ways that you could have connections. You know, you could have the neighborhood, or you could get together with your buddies and whatever. A lot of that fell away during the 70s and 80s, particularly in the cities, but in the countryside too. And so there hasn't been a lot of other stuff. And I think that now is a moment, it will be interesting to see if that will start to crop up. And so if I understand your point correctly, you're asking me to be attentive to not necessarily assume that people are losing their attachment to attachment. Maybe what they're losing is their attachment to those old kinds of attachment spheres that were always already problematic. Is that?
Yeah, that's definitely, I think, in line with the question. But also thinking in the book, I know especially after when you write about the post-3/11 period, there are moments when a notion of Japan is able to mediate certain types of volunteerism and forms of even exchange that exist outside of the family or the workplace. Obviously, there's now Buddhist temples that are also creating spaces for such exchanges. And so it seems that there's a lot happening, and I was just curious to hear more about the sort of ideas of togetherness that might possibly allow forms of exchange and that seem to be, I think it is, I like the argument that they're pointing to places of attachment beyond those conventional sites, and therefore have this liberating potential, or at least an emergent potential.
And of course, not to be too naive, I mean, the government right now, you know, the Prime Minister of Abe is very right, and is also, I mean, there's a possibility of trying to milk and manipulate a sense of, oh my God, Japan is falling apart and we've lost our, you know, our sense of the social. And, you know, the Constitution is going to be, you know, Abe's going to press really hard to change the Constitution. And the Olympics are around the corner, you know, 2020. And so, yeah, there are calls to be Japanese. And after 3/11, as you know, if you've, you know, read the book, and, you know, there were calls immediately, if you're Japanese, you know, Japanese come together, which also meant you better not leave. You know, and you better not even leave Tohoku. I mean, there's been a lot of, you know, pressure placed on people to be Japanese and be Japanese in a particular way. And then you will be solid Japanese, but there's also an injunction to define and, you know, fill that out in very particular ways. So there is the possibility of something much more, you know, interesting and maybe liberatory emerging. There's also a possibility of something much more, you know, there are people who say Japan's gonna become fascist again. So there's, you know, I think we can't be too naive or to, you know, to not think about all the possibilities. Yeah, Lauren.
Thanks so much for that. That was really great. And I think, you know, we're seeing around a lot of places right now because of the economic crisis, a kind of the question of the relation of the social as a space of proximity versus a question of the social as a place of connectedness or attachment. And proximity, that kind of language is much more like the kind of language you're describing of people being near each other in the city. Bye.
No,
Can I make you leave?
No, I'm going to get my pen.
That's like weird. I'm sorry. I'll call you later. I've just been thinking, you know, listening to people's conversation. I was having a lot of Michael's question too about, well, you know, there are lots of different kinds of connectedness, but the relation between connectedness and what I would call the inconvenience of other people. Like when you know, like if I'm only connected to you and it's convenient to me, then what I'm not having to experience is reciprocity as obligation. I'm experiencing the possibility of like a certain, like it's always part of what I think you're doing that's so fantastic is to ask them, where is the floor? of social dynamics. Where's the floor of reciprocity? So we would be able to see once again what n+1 is. And so what looked like solitude before would now be n+1. What looked like loneliness before would now be n+1. And the temporality of connectedness in relation to the inconvenience of the inconvenience of being in a family, the inconvenience of being in a relation, that all of that stuff, you're saying that's how it loosened up so that the intensities of the social have been diffused, which doesn't mean people aren't having social relations all the time, but they get to have it by like being a regular somewhere as opposed to being known somewhere, something like that. And so I was trying to think, so I have a lot of just like questions from my stupidity about, is there a social movement culture? Is there a critique of heterosexuality? I was seeing, questions about something I think about a lot in the U.S., which is a kind of social ethics around who's in production versus who's out of production. So that what has constituted the liberal state, which we never really had a welfare state here, was all about babies and old people, right? Like they aren't in production, so does the social have a space for them? And what happens when you have a general economic crisis where the social doesn't, from that definition of the social, are they there? So I wondered if, and you're interested in affect, so I was thinking, well, what other register could you have? To think about this, and I think your question was really important about this, and I kept thinking people want to matter to the conditions of their existence. And when you don't have any attachment to institutions that orchestrate, that deliver mattering en masse, then you're in a crisis about, well, where will you have an impact? And so thinking about impacting rather than recognition. I mean, so I'm just trying to say that we need to develop a language of dialing back people being in the social, because the social offers itself as having fewer resources. And I just wondered if you had other, languages that you.
Wow, that's great, Lauren. All of that. I mean, what you say about whether you matter, whether you have an impact. Does the social have a place for those who are not productive? Because another part of this is not only whether you matter or get recognized or not. How would you know? But then also, how do you live? I mean, that's another thing about precarity, is how are you living? I mean, because there are cases of people who die in their apartments, in buildings where they've lived for 20 years, and they lost a job. And really, they didn't feel comfortable asking the neighbor next door, or the neighbor didn't notice that they weren't coming out of their apartment. And so, right.
Can I have two questions? One is just the dumb person question is like social welfare state. What's like so.
It's pretty,
And the other is, I think one thing that's happening now in the U.S. that I'm just super interested in is people and their pets. Like the kind of sense that well, I don't have a clue if I have a relation of permanency at work or with my friends even, or let alone love. Let's not even get into that. But I've got some pets. And the pet, I think this is, from what I've read about post-3/11 and all sorts of things, there's a whole culture of that you would recognize as a sentimental culture.
Social welfare. I mean, I think that it's there is social work. I mean, there are a lot of different categories, but it's particularly if you're younger, it's kind of hard to tap into it. And then there are people who have MPOs, which is what they're called in Japan, that will help you do that. And one of the persons who I worked with, who I talk a lot about in the book, Yuasa Makoto, has come up with a manual for taking you through the steps of getting welfare. And if you go to his Moyai, if you go to his MPO on Tuesday for consultancy day, there are volunteers who will take all your information and they will go with you to the welfare office and they will try to help you. There's also, in Japan, as in so many places, there's also a kind of an ethos of not wanting to, of embarrassment and shame, which is part of this issue of wanting to matter and not wanting to look like you're a loser, because there's a big rhetoric of winners and losers. And, to be a winner the courses, those social institutions that are going to mediate that. And, you can't be a winner by not having a job that brings you in a certain amount of salary and having, kids and getting married, So, there is social welfare. It's not adequate. And Japan, particularly in the 70s, 80s, it wasn't a welfare state. It expected the family and the corporation to be the welfare institutions. Your family was supposed to take care of you, so that's in part of the crisis. Pets, big pet culture. Big pet culture. There's also a big abandoned pet, problem in Japan as well. There's also one of the things that I write a little bit about in the book. There's a lot of other places that you can get, attachment, connection, affix, whatever you would call it. You can go to cat cafes. And you go for a 45-minute set, and you can go for another 45-minute set, and you can pet all the cats, and they're great, and they're very cute, and then you don't have to tend to them. You can also pay to walk somebody's dog. So they're not paying you, you're paying them. Right.
But it's interesting, because your discourse is Jeremiah discourse, effectively, but this is a place where it's
right now. Well, one of my friends who was middle-aged woman, had 2 kids who weren't paying her much attention, had left the house, had a husband who wasn't paying her much attention. She had a job, but she was very depressed, and she got a dog. And it's been transformative. And because she walks the dog and meets people when she's walking. And now she has little dinner parties with her dog pals. And no kidding, it's...
people. Like her dog pals are people.
Yeah, no, sorry, yes. Yes, her dog pals are people, but of course in Japan, there are also all these other ways of connecting. I mean, there's characters, there's relations with characters, there's dolls, and there's a big thing about dolls. You can go, I've been in one of these doll stores where you can get your doll and you can customize your doll with the eyeballs and the fingernail, and you have a relationship with the doll. And there's a lot, there's also rental families. You can rent a family to come and hang out with you as if it was your family. So there are a lot of other kinds of provisions, and the robotic care industry in Japan is very well developed and thinking about how to come up with, care robotics for the elderly as they get lonely and need care. And so it's a really, there's a lot that's happening. And then the government too is worried about some of these things and is trying to put money in, but how precisely? And there's a lot that's happening. And thank you. Yeah, there's someone right here.
Yeah. So I'm interested also in thinking about, sort of tapping off with Professor Fisher and Professor Kurland a little bit, thinking about how, besides just what is the role of the state sort of in this, but also thinking about how are these deaths sort of announced, and does sort of local government or anything play a role in that, and sort of how are records kept, especially for this sort of thinking about sort of going into these things and seeing so many sort of names and placards and that, and thinking about, and then for social media, how it's sort of shared from one person to the next, an individual. So I'm curious about how people are sort of thinking about relating to each other via through the state or not through the state with this announcement that somebody's gone.
Well, the media is pretty, ever present in Japan. And the media, there are a lot of stories now in the media about people who are dying alone. And so is the media kind of intensifying that? Is it producing that? Is it sensationalist? Maybe. Maybe. And even the NHK special, NHK is the national broadcasting. So the Muen Shikai special, I don't know, did you see it? Yeah. That too was pretty, it was asking these questions, but it was also pretty, and you go into these rooms of people who are living all by themselves, and then you see what happens when their bodies, and now there's services that will go in and take care of, and it feels awful. And apparently the reaction to that special amongst young people were shocked and really worried that they may be on the path of becoming, becoming a lonely dyer, a few decades down the road. And so there are these stories that are passed, on television and the media, on the social media, about loneliness and about, And then there are also other places, like there are other, what are they called? What is Loft Plus One? What is that, like an art? What is, these, what is it called when you go to like a club for music, and what is the word for that? No, just like a venue where a club, okay. Well, they have like clubs. They also have a lot of clubs, live house, maybe a live house, is that maybe a live house, that will play music, but will also have talking events. And they have events where they talk about this, they talk about suicide, or they talk about loneliness. So with people who are isolated, there's a word in Japan now, himote, which means people who are like unpopular people. And they'll have, Valentine's parties for himote. I mean, so there's kind of interesting stuff that's cropping up and, proliferating in interesting directions. I mean, yes?
Hi, thank you. I think this was really fascinating, and I've been following your work. And I was thinking that these questions of connectivity, which arise out of this condition of precarity, and implicit in all of this, I think, this rhetoric of self-responsibility. Yeah. And I was thinking just how profoundly your examination of death is a rebuttal to the idea of self-responsibility, because the one thing you can't do for yourself is honor yourself once you're dead. And so it's this...
Well, I wonder.
Yes. Okay, and maybe not, but it's sort of, it challenges. So even in this neoliberal, yank yourself up by your bootstraps, work a little bit harder so you've lost the school, the family, the company, but you can still do it by yourself. Death seems to really challenge that idea, and the way that you're working with it made me sort of think about what kinds of adaptations, we're coming up with to try to deal with this ultimate challenge.
Thanks. I mean, I know we don't have much time, but that's really an interesting question, because there is so much responsibility being placed on the individual now to take care of, self-responsibilization, even onto death. And so there is a new kind of fad called shukatsu, kind of the market in the end. And you now can go to bookstores where they're shelves of how to handle death. One of it's called Ending Notes, where you can get a workbook and you write all the things down that you would like to be remembered about you. But the question that I don't quite get is, like, who's going to do that if you're being self-responsible? So in fact, are you doing it in the place of no one doing it for you? I mean, that, and again, as I said, then I'm just starting to do work on this, and I actually don't know, but there are a lot of counselors, and it is still tasking the individual to think about how to not burden your family, if you have one, not to burden anyone, be responsible. But you're right, what does that mean if the memory of yourself winds up, you're going to have the memory for yourself? I mean, what, That doesn't seem to quite, it's just kind of interesting. And the person who I ended with, who has written a number of books now about just let's get rid of funerals. I mean, he just says, look, it's racket, and we just don't need this anymore. I mean, it's for the living, not for the dead. So just be the kind of living who doesn't need it. And that's another, and he's pretty popular. So I don't know what that says. It's kind of interesting. Thanks.
Let's thank Anne.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks.